the number of the flood stories, 200 plus to 500 plus, being recorded around the world. They are common in Asia, the islands south of Asia, the Americas, being found all the way from Tierra del Fuego, which is on the tip of South America, to the Arctic. They are more rare in and Europe, but they are to be found in Greece, Persia, Syria, Scandinavia, India, China, Mexico, Indonesia, Melanesia, Polynesia, Micronesia, Australia. And like I said,
So many have. Wow. So Eskimos also have these stories. So this is really fascinating for me that, like, almost every culture in humanity is talking about some kind of a flood. So I'm just stuck there, Yeah, that itself is fascinating for me. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome back to Incisive Thoughts. And today we have another very interesting topic for you guys. Today's guest is going to be someone who needs no introduction at all, who is a guest that we've always had on our channel. It's like it's like part of the family of Incisive Thoughts. So today we have none other than our brother Gerry Coghlan on this. He's coming on this channel, and today's topic is something very interesting. Today, we are planning to have a discussion on the analysis of varying explanations given by scholars across 18th and 19th century behind the flood stories of the world. Like, we find cross-cultural similarity between many cultures having peculiar similarities regarding flood stories and flood narratives. So, inshallah, brother Gerry is going to unpack that for us. And welcome, brother Gerry, to the platform. Can you just give us some explanation on what exactly the topic is going to be for this discussion?
Yeah, so as you said, it's been known for quite some time that there are collections of flood stories from pretty much all over the world. Certain areas have more stories, and certain areas have longer and more detailed stories, and vice versa. Certain areas have less stories with less detail, and so on. But I will start by analysing opinions of various scholars who were writing between the mid 1800s up to the early 1930s. Some of them compiled collections themselves, and some of them analysed earlier collections of flood stories from different scholars. So the purpose of the episode is just to hash out what is the best explanation for all of these flood stories. It's as simple as that.
Okay.
So obviously, we have the flood story in the Quran, the story of Noah, peace be upon him. Because these were all European scholars writing from various different European countries at the time, the standard, the mainstream flood story back then was obviously the biblical story. So I'm going to be stacking the opinions of the scholars, both Christian and non-Christian, against and around the biblical story rather than the Quranic narrative. But the biblical story and the Quranic narrative, they agree on many of the points. There are some differences, and there are some things we cannot accept as Muslims in the story of Noah. But these details are besides the point for the purpose of this episode. Like I said, it's just to work out the best explanation for all the flood stories to be found across the globe. Now, as I said, some areas have much more detailed stories and more stories. The hub of the story, so to speak, is Mesopotamia, the Middle East. As you would expect, the people of Noah, we don't have the exact location for them, but it's a given that they were from somewhere in the Middle East. Some scholars have said like Syria to South Turkey and stuff like this. Allah knows best, but it's a given that they were from somewhere in the Middle East. And one evidence for this is in Surah Nuh, the 5 false gods that are mentioned are Arabic names. They're not Arabized names like, for example, Ya'juj and Ma'juj. They're not Arabic names, they're Arabized words. but the 5 false gods in Surah Nuh are fully Arabic names and were worshipped later by the Arabs as well anyway. And there's other evidences to show that Noah was speaking a Semitic language, if not Arabic, then Proto-Arabic, and so on and so forth. So, yeah, that's why we find the Middle East, the stories are longer, they're more detailed, they agree more with the biblical version. Now, as you spread out, the flood stories do agree with the biblical version on some of the main themes. However, on some of the details, they're radically different, and many of them have polytheistic elements. So do the Middle East stories, but just don't expect similar stories to the Quranic and the biblical narrative. Sometimes the stories become very simple to the point of childishness. Sometimes they also do quite clever explanations of worldly phenomena as well at the same time. And sometimes they become really short as well, but everything will fall into place as we go on. So basically, obviously, the flood, if you're Muslim or Christian, was a historical event, an event that actually took place. The main contentions against this are two. Contention one is that the flood stories were borrowed, if not entirely, they were at least subjected to missionary influence. And contention two, main contention two, is that the flood stories have independent origins and they derive from local floods in various different parts of the world. And contention, there's even a third, there's other contentions as well, but they're really woeful. We'll just go into the other ones briefly, but there's a third kind of opinion that has mixed between contention one and contention two, which is probably a sign of desperation. But they say that they have independent origins and they have missionary influence. And even some highly respected scholars of the day have come up with this idea as well. But going back to what we said in the earlier videos about original monotheism and such, it's because they utterly discount even the possibility of revelation. They're kind of forced down certain roads with the flood stories as well. But that's why they have to come up with these theories, and that's why they get a bit silly as well. So I'll start by listing out the scholars and summaries of their conclusions. So, number one is a chap called Heinrich Luken. He was a German Catholic priest, lived from 1815 to 1869, and he analysed stories from Asia, the West Indies, Persia, India, China, Europe, the Americas, and the Pacific Islands. And he made the first major collection of flood stories from travel reports, which he summarized himself. He believed the deluge, the flood, was a real event, but manifold changes occurred over time in the stories echoed by the different cultures. He believes that there was degeneration in the stories, that they degenerated into local or national flood stories, which seems to be correct, via different processes. I don't have time to go into the processes, but the point of highlighting these opinions is not for the opinions themselves. Some of them are really weird. Some of them agree that the flood was a real event, but the point is to show that there was enough flood stories from all around the world to warrant explanation from top scholars back in the day. So the second one is Richard Andre. He's a German, was a German geographer and ethnologist. He summarizes 88 stories from the Middle East, Asia, Europe, Africa, Australia, the Pacific, and the Americas. So he wrote about the geographical distribution of the stories, the lack of evidence for a common origin, according to him, the natural causes of floods, and a survey differentiating between original and tampered versions. He says 62 of the 88 show no evidence of borrowing. He protests against the idea of cross-cultural borrowing and maintains, this is key because I'm going to mention this later on a number of times, he maintains the accusation of borrowing must be substantiated by evidence, which everything must be, but here he's being honest. He's saying he can't find any evidence of borrowing in many. So he says if this evidence can't be demonstrated, he assumes an independent origin on the basis of which, according to him, is the psychic unity of mankind. Now, I hope people don't need a refutation for this for obvious reasons. He doesn't believe the flood was a real event. Doesn't believe it was a real universal event. He believes they were local events that arms and legs were added to over time. And he believes that the biblical account was copied from the Babylonian sources, but he believes the Babylonian flood to be real. Now, this is very easy to demonstrate as false now. It probably wasn't back then, but now it is quite easy to demonstrate as false. But I'm going to highlight the Middle Eastern stories and their features later. So the next scholar is Maurice Winternitz, who was an Australian ethnologist and a Sanskrit scholar. So he studied 73 flood narratives. And he says 30 of them reflect the Babylonian or biblical tradition, not the biblical, Babylonian or biblical. And therefore, according to him, they have influence of missionary teachings. But he then mixes the two opinions, as I said. He goes so far as to say some of these 30 may have been indigenous, but they were altered after contact with missionaries and contaminated with the Bible narrative. But other scholars have said his assumption of missionary influence and diffusion is weak, especially in the case of the Indian version, which has now been shown to be an independent tradition. So he was anti being a universal event, and he combined between the missionary influence, diffusion, contamination, and the local, many local flood events that some people come up with. So next up is Edward Joseph Woods, a theological lecturer from Oxford, who focused more on the flood traditions in the developed civilizations, the literate civilizations, so to speak, rather than the tribes. Obviously, he believed in the reality of the biblical flood, being a Christian. He also gives a number of explanations for the flood stories found in various regions. He gives 5, which some of them are really strange as well, but he says they are actual reflections of the biblical tradition. He says some are independent flood traditions, and some of them are. They definitely are. And even other Christians have said this as well. Or they are pseudo-scientific explanations of natural phenomena, such as shells found in mountainous areas. This is quite weird as well. I mean, you got to jump through a lot of hoops for this. Or they are part of cosmological systems, and they kind of are in some of the stories, because a flood is part of a greater destruction story or a greater story as well. So that's kind of right. Or they are nature myths. I think this one is a bit weak as well. His work has also been criticized by many other scholars. And he says that earlier flood stories of the local variety were more realistic and were embellished over time. So, moving on.
Yeah, so I have one question.
Yes.
So since we are having this conversation before, before we actually started this discussion, you told me something that was very, very fascinating. You said that there are approximately around 200 to 570 stories.
Yeah. 270. Sorry.
Okay.
270 to over 500, depending on who counts. The differences are what they accept as a flood story. And like some regions have multiple flood stories with some variations. So some people just count 4 flood stories from one region as one, whereas others count them as separate. And also, obviously, for obvious reasons, as time goes on, the ones who analysed the stories later had more to work on. So they actually had more stories to analyze and add to the collections. So yeah, but if you want to take the high opinion, it's over 500.
Wow. So okay, so it is from 270 to 500.
Yes.
So even if I take the if I take the high opinion, like, so there are more than 500 cultures who have across the world, across every corner of the world, I mean, and they talk about
500 stories, but some of them are multiple stories from the same culture. So you can't say 500 cultures.
okay, let's even if we take the lower scale, which is 200, that's something very shocking. It's very powerful that 200 cultures also, if 200 cultures are talking about a flood, I mean, there is something really like, something that cries out for an explanation.
Exactly.
So
that's why people were pushed to come up with explanations, because of the amount
just by
and the spread of. So yeah, like I said in the beginning, sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, like I said in the beginning, some of the stories are very simple, even silly in points, although some are clever and silly at the same time. Some of the stories are very brief as well, so they would be included in the 500. And the closer you get to the Middle East, the longer and more detailed the stories are. So yeah.
Wow. And then you also mentioned that there are scholars also agreeing that there is degeneration that has happened to these stories,
yes,
to some extent. So we can expect, we don't have to expect that everything would be exactly the same within the stories. But the fact that even if you find some similarity, that is still very shocking and cries out for an explanation.
Yeah, we'll mention the kind of similarities and differences in the next section.
Wow. So yeah, so I'm just really excited to get to that part. So yeah, please go ahead with continue the mentioning of scholars.
So the next one is Wilhelm Wundt, who was a German psychologist, and he presents his reading of the flood stories relying on Andre, whom we mentioned earlier. And he says in many cases he cannot decide whether they are of local origin or whether they have been borrowed from foreign influence and reshaped by local lore and experience. He does acknowledge the older versions are to be found among primitive peoples, but he says the tribal cultures don't have the same ethical motivations within their stories as the Middle Eastern ones. So he assumed that myth development followed one set of rules in tribes and another set of rules within civilizations. He says civilized cultures have more established ethical rules, and this is reflected in their lore, and vice versa for tribal cultures. So a myth takes the form of the consciousness of the people it comes from, but his law that he came up with has been criticized and said it's highly dubious. This development of myth is said to be highly dubious. So the next guy is James George Frazer, and he's got a collection of flood stories in a bigger book. It's called Folklore in the Old Testament. But he's put together over 200 stories.
Wow.
Back in the late 1800s, early 1900s. So he did a lot of focus. So he focused mainly on the Middle Eastern ones. I don't think he knew about the Sumerian one because that was discovered later, even though it's earlier. Palestinian story. Greece actually has a number of the flood stories itself. And he also uses Andre's work to analyze the stories from primitive cultures. He believes the Bible story was not historical, but that it developed from the Babylonian story. And he believes local flood stories originated from more sober accounts of real events and later took on fantastic and cosmic dimensions. Sometimes he leans towards favoring Christian influence. He was criticized for not taking into account the meaning of flood myths in the social and religious lives of natives, and also some of his accusations of Christian influence were said to be dubious. We're going to come back to Frazer anyway later as well, because he's got such a big collection. He also does a bit of he does the same trick that the evolutionists did with original monotheism stories. You get me? He says the purer and the more sophisticated one has to be later, according to the lines of development that he was proposing for mankind. Well, we'll come back to him. Next up is Johannes Riem, who was a German astronomer, science writer, also a Christian, and studied comparative mythology. He has a collection of over 200 versions and bibliographical references to another 35. He surveys theories that attempt to explain the origin of the stories and gives statistical information about the presence or absence of certain motifs in them. So this guy's thing was trying to blend the scientific thought of the day with Christian philosophy. He did come up with some other weird theories as well. According to him, they are more common in Asia and on the islands immediately south of Asia and in North America. He rejects missionary influence. The flood stories for him reflect real history, and he believed that the traditions represent the early catastrophe of universal dimension. Or more accurately, he simply expanded on others who already said this. Next up, Anton Wilhelm Nieuwenhuis, who was a Dutch anthropologist. And on the basis of Riem's collection, what we just mentioned, actually, he argues that flood stories represent what he calls primitive science. Cultures not familiar with the concept of evolution describe the transition from the world of myth to the real world in terms of the cataclysmic, in this case the flood. He based his ideas on some out-of-date notions about tribal mentality, which were fashionable in his time, and his theory is classified as bizarre. Next is Werner Müller, a German ethnologist. So he focused on the flood stories from the Eskimos and the Indians along the northwest coast of America and in central California, to a lesser extent in South America. But he says it cannot be denied that the flood story belongs to the oldest stratum of Native American culture, i.e. the lower hunters and gatherers. He does not say conclusively, he does not give a conclusive statement about the origin of the stories, but he does seem to favour that they came from a real historical event. He also mentions the traditions of the Andaman Islanders resembling those in America, and takes this as conclusive evidence for the extreme age of the tradition. He was criticised by some for not considering the idea of missionary influences, and for one or two other small mistakes as well. Next we come to Hermann Baumann, Professor of African Studies and Social Anthropology in Vienna and Munich. And he collects and studies the flood mythology of the African peoples. He comes to the conclusion that there are only a few traces of missionary influence. And he says, according to him, many of these myths relate to and are derived from experience of the rainy season. And not much is considered to be satisfactory of his interpretation. However, his work is considered a valuable collection of African flood mythology, at least. So another German, Klaus Westermann, who was writing a bit later than the rest, 1974. He was a biblical scholar. So he divides the cultures, analysing the primitive and advanced. He believes in the advanced cultures, the story is reshaped according to the requirements of more developed and ethnically sophisticated civilization, just like a few guys ago. He comes to 4 conclusions. 1, flood stories among European non-Semitic people can be taken as evidence for the presence of such stories in prehistoric cultures. 2, that the non-European flood stories are not derived from missionary teaching, or alternatively, what dependence they show on the missionary teaching is irrelevant. All flood stories are originally connected with rituals that dramatize and visualize, and that was the 3rd. And 4, in more advanced cultures, the primitive flood mythology was revised and supplemented from a religious and ethical perspective. Again, his methodology has been heavily criticized, especially the idea that the flood stories were dramatized and he was also criticized for underplaying possible missionary influence. Next is a Dutch Sanskrit scholar called Jan Gonda, who was also writing in the 70s. So he analyzes classic versions of the flood myths in Indian literature, and he refutes the accusation that the Indian stories were derived from the Mesopotamian, the Middle Eastern prototypes. And he says the differences between them make it literally impossible. He says diffusion is impossible regarding Indian stories. And he's most interesting because he shows there was weak methodology used to attempt to tag the Indian stories as being derived from either the biblical or the Babylonian ones. And last up, we have someone called Frazer, who was also Dutch, an ethnologist, and he worked in Papua New Guinea. He collects only 20 versions of the flood story, all from Western New Guinea. And he wrote brief notes on them, but others added to his commentary. And they come to the conclusion that these flood stories are indigenous and they're not borrowed. So, in summary, there are those that believe the flood stories were based on a real event, and that's why the foundation or some foundational points remain the same. There are those who believe they originate from common structure of human mentality and are somehow a reflection of what they call primitive mentality. There are those that believe the flood myths are indigenous and related to local events, while also maintaining there is missionary influence on top. So that's the combining, that I mentioned earlier. It's also can be seen that acceptance was widespread of the notion that the biblical story was copied from the earlier Babylonian stories, or the Middle Eastern stories, which the Babylonians were. Some other more wild theories, they come from a tendency towards mythologizing floods and rains in general. They are mythical allegories for the setting of the sun, or it's a myth of the cyclical view of renewed creation. It's a renewal to basically reset man's cosmogony, which is really weird as well. And here's another very strange one, that it is a distorted transmission of an ancient myth, but it got distorted into history. Makes sense?
Distorted into history, as in how?
Yeah, there's the opinion that people come up with the flood myth for a particular moral lesson.
Okay.
So it was originally a myth, but arms and legs were added to it, and as it spread around,
Okay.
the opinion that
it's
taken as being something historic. Historicized myth, basically. Just another very strange theory.
Okay. Yeah.
So that's it for the prevalence of the opinions.
Yeah. So just one second, I want to pause there and I just want to reflect with you. What has happened here, like what at least I found interesting, is that when you're quoting these scholars who some have collected like around, has an account of like 70 stories, some 80 stories, some 20 stories, some 200 stories, or 200 sources basically in some sense. What I found fascinating is that they themselves are like saying that, you find many stories in India, like a particular set of group in India, a particular set of group in North America, a particular, even you said that you spoke about Andaman Islanders, and so many of the primitive cultures also have like these stories. Some are in Africa, as you mentioned, and a lot of them are in the Middle East. So in my head, like, the picture that I get here is that, they're scattered all across the world, everywhere. Even I think you mentioned Green Island, if I'm not wrong.
Which island?
Green Island? Oh, sorry, it was the Eskimos also had that story.
Yes, the Eskimos have them as well. Yeah.
Wow. So Eskimos also have these stories. So this is really fascinating for me that, like, almost every culture in humanity is talking about some kind of a flood. So I'm just stuck there, Yeah, that itself is fascinating for me. Like, what conclusion I derive from it. Maybe we can unpack that. But that itself is something really fascinating for me.
Yeah, it is fascinating, especially if you haven't heard of it before. It's really, really interesting.
Exactly.
Shall we move on a little bit?
Yes. So what is going to be the next session? Like next section, what is it going to cover?
The next section will be a look at the common points and some of the differences and where the differences lie and what the common points and differences mean when taken together.
Okay.
So, as we know, if a number of people are called to testify in the courthouse about something, if they all give the same testimony right down to the minute details about something, it will be taken that they conspired upon this. Due to simple human error. Simple human error will come in if say 10 people are called to give evidence about something they witnessed, 8 months ago. People will not be able to recall the details exactly. And there's the phenomenon of false memories, and so many things will happen in the person's life in between now and then that can shade and color the view of what happened. So if they agree on some base details and the finer details of the story are different, that's a weightier testimony in court. So we apply this to the flood stories, and we see that on the base details are constantly recurring, but the finer details are different, sometimes radically different. Now, it's important to note that the base details don't always occur in every single story. And a lot of them they do, but sometimes they have some of them. Like one or two of them may be missing, and then they have another couple of the base details. So as I said, some of the flood stories are really short and like bizarre and so far away from what you may be thinking a flood story is that if you found them on their own, you would just let them go and not think any of them. If it wasn't for like 4 basic points, basic elements, which are to be found all over the world in them, then you could probably just dismiss like the majority of them, So, as I said, the number of the flood stories differs. There's 200 plus to 500 plus being recorded around the world. Literature discussing them is abundant. Their geographical distribution is not uniform, but it is worldwide. They are common in Asia, the islands south of Asia, the Americas, being found all the way from Tierra del Fuego, which is on the tip of South America, to the Arctic. They are more rare in America and Europe, but they are to be found in Greece, Persia, Syria, Scandinavia, India, China, Mexico, Indonesia, Melanesia, Polynesia, Micronesia, Australia. Now, like I said, some of these do show missionary influence for sure, and some you could make more of a case that they do, but it's not very clear that they do. But some do, to be honest about it. So the first point is that the reason for the flood was a moral reason. Obviously, we know from the story of Noah and the Quran, Allah told us that the people were doing shirk, association of partners with God. They were given our invitation to Islam for 950 years by Noah. And they weren't just doing shirk, they were doing other things as well. So shirk is the worst act that a human being can do. The Bible doesn't specifically focus on shirk, but it just says that Noah's people were totally wicked. They were absolutely wicked in multiple ways. Sometimes it comes because of lack of reverence for the gods or a particular god. Sometimes it's just because the gods got annoyed. Sometimes it becomes because of a transgression, either intentional or unintentional, against a particular god of the polytheistic pantheons. But the cause is something that mankind did always: disobedience, lack of piety, or some kind of transgression, even if it's a minor transgression. And in a lot of cases, forewarning is given to particular people or persons. Sometimes there's only one person. One person receives a warning from the gods or the supreme god of a tribe, or even sometimes there's no gods involved, but animals warn him of a flood to come that's going to wipe everyone out. So like I said, sometimes some of the main details are missing, And I just do one of the Indian stories now because the cause of this is a moral one as well. So like I said, there's multiple Indian flood stories, especially if you include the tribal ones. But in one tradition, it refers to the seventh king of the Hindus called Satyavrata, a man who reigned in Dravira, a country which was washed by the waves of the sea. During his reign, an evil demon named Hayagriva appropriated to himself the holy books. I think that means the Vedas, supposed to mean the Vedas, which the first Manu had received. The consequence was that the whole human race sank into a fearful degeneracy, with the exception of 7 saints and the king himself, who was considered a man of virtue. The story then tells how the divine Vishnu appeared to him in the shape of a fish and said, "In 7 days, all the creatures which have offended against me shall be destroyed by flood. Only you shall be saved in a capacious vessel." After 7 days, incessant torrents of rain descended, and ocean waves climbed beyond their shores. And it's said that the idea in this story is, in the absence of their holy books, the human race sank into a fearful degeneracy. So you have the moral cause, you have a warning from Vishnu, you have one man chosen, and one man saved. So yes, and then some scholars have said that the descendants of the first man of the new race, Manu, were collectively referred as Manucha, which means born of Manu, and some scholars say this actually equates to the word Mensch in German, which means man. So that's a little bit about Indian stories. And in one of the Greek stories, this one is quite brief. I don't recount it all anyway. It says Zeus was provoked into sending the deluge, either because of the enormous iniquity with which the earth was contaminated, because of the brazenness of men, or because of the existence of 50 monstrous sons of Sycophant. And the person who gets saved in the Greek story is called Deucalion. The Greeks have more than one story again as well. And it's pretty safe to say that the nearer geographically the stories come to the Middle East, the more truly they speak of the cause as moral corruption. The further you spread, let's say it's not a moral cause, it's more a cause of some bad behavior. Like the further you spread out into the more distant parts of the world from the Middle East, as we see anyway.
Yeah, but then what one thing that is really striking is that it's not that in many cultures, most cultures that you're talking about, is something, the flood is not something that is completely arbitrary. Like just mention that the flood happened, like a specific reason about some bad behavior or something immoral happened, and that was specifically the cause of the flood, and a causal relationship is linked to the flood. It is quite striking. So that is something you should not be neglected at all. I mean, that's marvelous, I think.
So the second base point, which is not exactly ubiquitous, but you can find it in every part of the world, is that an individual is warned about this in a personal manner. Obviously, Prophet Nuh, peace be upon him, in the Quran and the Bible, he's warned directly by God that the flood is to come. He's instructed to build the ark, take your family, take the people with you, take some creatures, and he's saved. So this doesn't need any further explanation. This happens in other stories as well, sometimes by one of the polytheistic gods, sometimes by animals on behalf of the gods, sometimes by animals with no god, but forewarning is given to a chosen person who is deemed worthy for whatever reason. So he's told, okay, mankind has become debased and corrupted. and they're going to be punished and wiped off the earth. But this is your chance, basically.
Wow.
So point number 3, and this is quite a strong one. The human race is wiped out by the flood. Okay. Now, why is this a strong point? This is actually more recurring than the other points as well, as far as I know, as far as I can see. It's a strong point because even though the tribal floods, they do take on local colorings. There's no doubt about it. Like the ark or the ship, it lands local in all the other stories. Usually up the mountain as well, not always, which is another common point, but it takes the floods take on local colorings, which is to be expected. If they don't have revelation reinforced and they don't have writing, as the stories spread, human error is to be expected. And over thousands of years, they're going to change. So we've experienced, well, not me and you, alhamdulillah, we haven't experienced flooding like ourselves, but as we know what happens when a local area gets flooded. Yeah, there's devastation, there's loss. It's tragic, but many people survive. Where I'm going with this. We've never experienced a flood where one person came out of it as a survivor, or two.
Right.
Many may be killed, but many survive. Yeah, so even if the flood takes on a local coloring, the fact that it says the human race got wiped out and then restarted by whichever character, shows it's an echo of some other event.
Exactly. Yeah, that's a good
echo
point.
Of the last tragic event that happened to mankind before they split up. Yeah, and like I say, this is one of the strongest points, and it's one of the more regular, reoccurring points. Everyone is wiped out, and the population gets restarted. Of course, it gets restarted from wherever the people are. But if you think about it, when the flood was sent, the whole earth was not populated anyway. Noah was sent to his people. So even in that, there was another. Understand?
Right.
It's on a local coloring.
Yeah, that's interesting. And so what you're trying to say is that it makes more sense within these narratives that there is this global, there is this echo where flavor of a local flavor is added within every story, but what it hints back to is something, because they're talking about all of humanity being wiped out, and that is something cross-culturally seen. It does indicate to some extent towards a narrative that is closer to what we believe in, what rather than the local flavor that every story has within it.
Yeah. So the local flavor is like the minor details, but as I said, this is an echo of something.
Okay.
This is an echo of an earlier event that was common to all mankind back then. Like I said, the flood did happen in the Middle East anyway, but that's the only area that was peopled at the time.
Okay. Makes sense.
Sometimes only one person actually survives in the local story.
Wow.
So that's why I said, even though the stories are simple and some come up with very clever ways as to how Earth gets repopulated. Sometimes two people survive, brother and sister, right? So in the Greek story, Deucalion and his wife Pyrrha, they repopulate the earth, but not by procreation. They throw stones behind them as instructed by Zeus, and these stones end up becoming people. And some scholars say there is actually a connection between the Greek words for stone and people. So they say this may have come from the flood story. There is other stories where the couple had a child or attempted to have a child. It's stillborn or died after birth. So out of anger, like the dad, he cut the child up and cast the pieces away, and they landed in different color soils, right? So let's say it happened in Thailand. The ethnicities there that have darker skin are explained because the soil that the pieces of the child chopped up landed in was darker. So they say the Thais are from this kind of soil, the Chinese are from this kind of soil, and the precursors of the Vietnamese are from this kind of soil. So there's quite clever ways of repopulating as well. And there's an echo from the Tamanakis tribe, who were on the banks of the Orinoco. Again, a flood was sent due to human wickedness or a god angered by lack of piety. Only one man and woman survived, and there's an echo of the Greek story in this somehow, because they are also said to have thrown over their heads coconuts. And from each coconut landed a different race of mankind.
Wow.
But this throwing behind is not found in many of the stories. It's just in a couple of them, but it does crop up in different areas as well. It's strange, but also interesting.
You know, one thing comes to my mind. If you remember our previous conversation we had, which was around language, and within that we were talking about something where in many cultures all over the world there was this also echo of after the flood language splitting or something
Yes,
like that.
Yeah. If you think about it, these two events would have been the last two major events to happen before mankind split and broke up totally.
Oh,
You know, that's if the language was divided like that. But it's just you got to ask how these division, like these instant division of language stories, are everywhere as well. Again, in their details they differ, but in the base they're the exact same. They say that the division of humankind's language is instantaneous. Methods are different, but if anyone wants to go back and watch part 2 of the language one, feel free. But it's a lot of similar lines. You're correct. So the next main point is that the world was repopulated from the survivors, regardless of how many there were. Sometimes there's more than 1 or 2, 6, 7, 8. I think up to 16 in one story or something. But these people repopulated the world after, and obviously the repopulation, according to each story, started from that place. You get it? So that's another.
their location.
The base detail is the same. Another localization.
Every local story will have their area where it started.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, that makes sense.
And again, with local flooding or ordinary flooding, for want of a better word, many families do escape. You know, many families do escape. And there's no, in the flood stories, there's no, how to put it, there's no mention of people surviving in one area and then traveling to another area and meeting a group of survivors from there. It's always like they repopulated the world from themselves or through the mystical magic.
Yeah, so you mean to say a critique of the local stories is that having these elements and then having these elements as in, like, you know, families not surviving, and then talking about a local flood, they don't match. There's a mismatch there, where even wherever a local flood happens, there would be potential for families surviving because it is a local flood. But the fact that so that's an issue with understanding that it's totally within, like, you know, the culture having just one local flood, rather it is indicating towards something more, a bigger flood because of, in some sense, only one person surviving or 2% surviving, or just a few people, a bunch of people surviving. Okay.
Yeah. So the next point is the ark always grounds locally. Now this again is it's a strong argument against borrowing or the missionary influence. Because why on earth does the ark always ground local? If they took if they took from the biblical story via the missionaries that were sent to them, then they would have a grounding in Arafat, isn't it? The ark always grounds locally. It doesn't ground. Just some examples. There's loads more, but it doesn't always land on a mountain, by the way. Sometimes it just lands on the ground after the waters recede. Sometimes it lands in trees, because sometimes the boats are small. But but it does often land on a mountain as well, which is kind of natural. If the flood comes up that high, you expect to get this. So in Greece, it lands on Mount Parnassus. In India, it lands on the Himalayas. In the Andaman Islanders story, it lands on a place called Wotemi. The people of Sumatra say the ark landed on Mount Marapi, the Fijians on Mount Mbenga, the Mexicans on Mount Colhuacan, the Yuan on Mount Dromedary, and the Northern Maidu on Keddy Peak in Sacramento. So we never have any mention of the thing landing in the Middle East, outside of the Middle East, which you would expect if there was missionary influence. Something else which is a shared characteristic at the base, but the details are hugely different in this one, is animals are employed in the story for different reasons. Sometimes they give the warning. Sometimes they're sent out to scout. Sometimes they're used to check the depth of the water to see if those on the ship can safely disembark. So we spoke about the Indian story as a fish involved. In the Ancasmarca story, there is an eagle. In a Peruvian story, a llama gives the warning. The Cherokees have a dog giving the warning. The Crees of Manitoba say that several waterfowl were sent to dive to the bottom to check the depth of the water, but they all drowned. Then a muskrat, who was sent on the same task, succeeded in bringing up a mouthful of mud. So it was taken from that, and the waters were receding enough. The Ojibwe tribe have something very similar. There is a type of bird called a loon, who was reported to be swimming underwater after the flood. And the loon was asked to do them a favor to dive deep down and see if you can find the earth. He was unsuccessful. So then the character in the story, who was called Menabushu, he also found a muskrat. But this muskrat was stiff with cold and almost dead. So he took him out of the water, warmed him up with his breath, brought him back to life. He says, little brother, neither of us can live without the earth. Dive into the water, and if you're able to, bring me some earth. If it is only 3 grains of sand, I shall be able to make something out of them. So he dived immediately, and after a long time reappeared dead, floating on the water. Menabushu took it up and discovered in one of his little paws a couple of grains of sand. So he blew these into the water, and they immediately became islands and grew into land for him to step off. So again, like, these kind of details at least make it virtually impossible for the details that have come from the missionaries. Like, they have no truck with the biblical story whatsoever. Birds are used, of course, in the biblical story, but nothing in this manner is highlighted about the animals and stuff. So the usage of animals is common, but the animals are different, and how they're employed is different as well.
At this point, I think, if someone does not know what the Islamic narrative is when it comes to Nuh alayhi salam, I think, they should at least go back and just read what the Islamic narrative is, and they might find it really shocking in terms of the points that
the Surah Nuh is a great place to start. The story is mentioned in other surahs as well, but if you see the manner of the denial of the people of Nuh, it's the same way people deny today. You've got some dawah tips there via the Nuh as well, and you've got many aspects to the story, but the chapter of Nuh is a great place to start, and then you can go on the other chapters. So yes, there is another Christian scholar called Custance, who started studying the flood stories, but he started with smaller collections which are part of Bible commentaries. So he first thought that after reading these smaller collections that missionary influence did actually occur. But he realized why after a while. After broader reading, I think especially James Frazer and others, who wasn't a Christian, obviously, he realized this was because these exegetes had shared similar traditions between themselves and specifically chose the ones to draw the reader's attention. And then he highlights, after reading Frazer's collection and stuff, he says basic elements of the stories are all the same, or recur a lot, to be more accurate. But the other details, the nature of the warning, the nature of the escape vessel, the role of the animals, these differ in such a way that borrowing from the biblical version is excluded. And he also says that native people have an excellent ability to recall the details of any story which they have learned. So it's not really feasible that they would make errors with their own lore either, because one of their strengths, one of their fortes was recalling their own lore, as long as they had learned it, of course. So he says as well, the best explanation is that the native traditions are distant recollections of a past event which was so stupendous, it was never forgotten, even though the details themselves became blurred and they were infused with local ideas. So what faded out was basically replaced with local colouring or local ideas. And he then highlights the same main reasons given. So let's apply a bit of common sense here.
Yeah.
If, let's just say there was missionary influence, right? You saw that the people analysing the collections were mid-1800s to early 1900s, which obviously means the missionaries were out collecting earlier. So this is a time when they had nothing like modern communication methods. It's not possible they could have conspired on this. And even if they did, how on earth would you come to the conclusion to conspire on this? So you got missionaries, setting off from Portugal, Germany, France, Britain. They're going to all the different continents of the world. And they decided to try and infuse some details of the Christian flood story into already existing independent stories, which by itself is silly.
Yeah.
For this to recur. And it gets even worse because there is no mention of David and Goliath, Samson and Delilah, the Exodus, Sodom and Gomorrah, Egypt, so on and so forth, not even with a local colouring. There's no mention of these at all. So why did it only happen with the flood story if the missionaries were pushing, you know? Why not with the other stories, and why not with the miracles of Jesus at least? Or at least
exactly
the thing they would have inserted is a prophecy that would have made it look like it's leading to Jesus, or the biblical version of Jesus, not Isa and Isa. No?
Exactly.
You think like they would have done something better, that they could have done much better if they wanted to impose on the the local stories, you know. And as well, locals had jealousy over their lore, which we just kind of touched on a little bit as well, you know.
And you know, that is what I was wondering. It makes no sense that, first of all, it makes no sense for the primitive tribes to take just one aspect of some other story which they have no connection to, and then just add on to their literature and consider them to be something that actually happened. And secondly, this is from the perspective of those tribes and those cultures themselves, but from the perspective of the missionary also, if they have this goal, obviously they would try to do something which they would think is beneficial, which is give the message of the cross or Christianity or something fundamental to the Christianity, like the cross or atonement or something along those lines. But you see nothing like of that sort. You see nothing of that sort of, like, for example, resurrection or something. But we only find one specific detail about the flood, which makes no sense that, the missionaries would be only successful in in kind of infiltrating the culture with just one of their own stories, and they were unsuccessful in everything else. It makes no sense. And why would they even have that motivation?
It's madness. And if you think about
exactly,
like obviously as Christians, they do believe in the Old Testament, they have to, but realistically, you can remove the flood story from the Old Testament. It doesn't affect Christianity in the least. Like you can't remove the creation story. You cannot remove the biblical story of Adam and the fall. You can't remove these things because the New Testament theology depends on it. But you can actually remove the flood story hypothetically, and it has no effect whatsoever on Christianity. So it's like just the last thing they would do if they wanted to tamper and interfere with the local stories, you know.
And even if they wanted to tamper, it's not like a peanut job that you can tamper someone's job. I mean, obviously, and first of all, it took so much time. Even if they were missionaries, it took so much time for missionaries to actually speak to the people in their language and even understand their own story. Because as you have highlighted in the past, that many times, many tribal cultures, they were so reluctant that they did not even used to tell them their own stories. They used to hide them from these missionaries. So it's not just about hiding and getting to know their stories, but also adding your story to their story. I mean, that's too far-fetched.
Yeah. And touching on go back to something about the creation stories, it's been said that, like, if you want to accuse the natives of fabricating stories, it doesn't really make sense for them to come up with a flood story either. They said it would be much more likely that they would come up with a creation story to try and satisfy the want to understand human origins. Like, it makes no sense for them to come up with a flood story, and it adds nothing to them. You know?
Exactly. Yeah.
We find it all over the place. We find it all over the world. And even, like, there are tribes such as the Hopi Indians in America and the Incas living in the Andes who are really far from the sea. Yet they have flood stories where the water reaches the height of the mountains as well.
Wow.
You know, and it's set in some places as well, in tropical areas, it's said that people were shivering with cold as well. So that's taken to be some remnant of the original story as well. Because obviously we believe that the earth was commanded by God to rise its water from subterranean waters, but rain was also rained down upon the earth. So you would expect many people probably did die from cold as well, or at least suffered from cold greatly as well as the flood itself. But people in tropical areas of the world have reports that the people were shivering from the cold and stuff. So
wow,
you got plenty of little details like this as well. Yeah, so I think we'll go back to something Frazer said.
Okay.
Set this in the folklore of the Old Testament. And remember, there are three main Middle Eastern stories. Sumerian is older. Then you have the Babylonian, the Akkadian. I don't think he knew about the Sumerian one. I could be wrong. But he basically assumes that the biblical tradition is borrowed. Oh no, I think no, he does know about the Sumerian version. He does. But he assumes that the biblical tradition is borrowed from the Babylonian or the Sumerian, basically along the line, because he's thinking along the same lines of those who came up with evolution of religion frameworks. You know, development along fixed lines from crude to complex, ugly, beautiful, so on and so forth. So everything is on the improvement. So.
And I think this is also
theistic tradition has to be derived from the polytheistic one, according to this logic, you know.
Right.
So he'd say,
I think,
yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead. So I was saying, I mean, this is very common, which sometimes, you see in apologetics as well, where some people try to denounce the Christian faith and even the Old Testament by saying that, because of the flood stories, we get an example, because we find something like Epic of Gilgamesh and other epics that are prior to the biblical narrative. Therefore, they have been borrowed from there, and that is why Christianity is false, or these scriptures are unreliable. They just copied it, and the accusation of plagiarism is applied.
Yeah.
So I think within this, we'll get more clarity on what exactly.
Yeah, that's a good point, because before I go to Frazer, people who study folklore have a number of tools to separate what is older from what's more new. One of the tools they use is that over time, arms and legs get added to a story. So more fantastical elements, more fantasy-like elements get added over time, as we see with the story of the muskrat and the bird sent out. Like, these are details that, according to this principle, they get added over time. Now, all three of the other Middle Eastern accounts have more fantastic details than the Bible account. The Bible account is much more sober and down to and realistic. So that's it's not copied from them. How has it lost all the arms and legs? How has it managed legs and all the other gods are dust? They're gone. Like, the Bible tradition is monotheistic. So Frazer, anyway, he says, formerly under the influence of the biblical tradition, inquirers were disposed to identify legends of the Great Flood wherever found with the similar Noachian flood, and to suppose in them we had more or less corrupt versions of that great catastrophe, of which the only true and authentic record is preserved in the book of Genesis. Such a view can hardly be maintained any longer, even if we allow for the numerous corruptions and changes which oral tradition necessarily suffers in passing from generation to generation and land to land through countless ages. We shall still find it difficult to recognize in the diverse, often quaint, childish, or grotesque stories of a great God the human copies of a single divine original. I'm going to break the quote and come back to it now, but no one maintains that those copies are from Revelation. You understand? So he's discounted the point. He's discounted Revelation altogether. So, like, the biblical, for us, the Bible is not Revelation as it was, but it still contains many, many, many echoes of it. The flood is one of the more clear ones. So for us, the Bible is from a Revelation. The Sumerian, the Akkadian, Middle Eastern are not, but that doesn't mean that they don't echo actual earlier event that was then re-revealed to the prophets of Israel and probably other prophets as well. I'm sure Abraham had Ismail, they had their stories of the flood as well, you know. So it's not as black and white as he's saying, and no one is saying that the tribal stories are copies of a single divine original. He even allows for these kind of, I suppose, infusions of characteristics of tribal stories which take it away from the matter-of-fact account. And then I'll go back to the quote now. So he says, and the difficulty has been greatly increased since modern research has proved the supposed divine original in Genesis to be not an original at all, but a comparatively late copy of a much older Babylonian or Sumerian version. No Christian apologist is likely to treat the Babylonian story with its strong polytheistic coloring as a primitive revelation of God to man. And if the theory of inspiration is inapplicable to the original, it can hardly be invoked to account for the copy. So he's saying, if they don't accept the Sumerian, the Babylonian, the Akkadian as revelation, then they have to reject the biblical version as revelation. So he's thrown everything out. He's thrown the baby out with the bathwater. You know?
Right.
Instead of even hypothesizing that it was a real event that happened, at least to the people in the Middle East, we don't say it was only occurred in the Middle East, but that's where the people who were white were. Then obviously you're going to have strong echoes of it there in the Mesopotamian cultures. And then as prophets come later, they would hear about this through the new revelations. You know? So he's kind of setting up a number of straw men, the saint.
Yeah. And I think he's starting from the assumption that revelation is not possible in some sense, or he's denouncing revelation to some extent. He's not even giving the possibility that it could be that the revelation later on comes in and clarifies the narrative out of those
Yes.
kind of arms and legs that have been added to the original thing.
Yes, yes. So then this for him discounts the biblical version as revelation, since it's borrowed from the grossly polytheistic original. So therefore he demonstrates it cannot possibly be inspired, and therefore it cannot be treated as the lone inspired original of which the all other native traditions are human copies. But no one is claiming that anyway. No one's claiming that the natives copied the biblical narrative. You get it? So he set up a number of straw men, as long as falling into the same trap as the religious evolutionists. So when it was pointed out to him, or when he discovered himself that even among coastal people or island people, that the waters come up to the heights of the mountains, for example, he then brings in earthquakes, tidal waves, or local dropping subsidence of the land, or violent tropical storms may have caused tremendous invasions of seawater in the form of exceptionally high tides. And he gives a number for these. I don't have the number, but he gives a number of examples which he believes are pretty conclusive. So we can't absolutely, totally deny that some of those accounts may have, I don't know, have some infusions from some events like this. But the accounts themselves don't paint a picture of waves coming inland off the sea, like tidal waves, and slowly smashing everything before it. But they paint a picture of slowly rising waters, that rise to the point where they wipe out whatever civilization was around at the time. Like we said, one of the main points is that humanity is wiped by the flood. And they paint a picture of the rising waters rather than waves crashing and earthquakes and all of this. So he's kind of ignored the details there, set up again. He's strawman again. So yeah, Custance then says virtually all of the stories that he analyzed 150. So, and he says in all of the 150 he analyzed, virtually all of them have only one family surviving. So he says, have there really been that many such catastrophes in every part of the world, even in the Arctic, of purely natural occurrences? It seems far simpler to assume that, with a few possible exceptions, these are not accounts of local events, but recollections of one single catastrophe, which left such an impression on the survivors and their descendants hundreds of generations later, that it was never forgotten.
Yeah, this makes more sense.
And again, he mentions their analogies and their differences. And he just says some of the said earlier again. So yeah, it does seem that sometimes in places like China as well, that some of their flood myths are related to local floodings, but they also seem to have like flood myths as part of cosmic events as well, which how they can be related to local flooding. So I suppose somewhere like that, you may get a mixture down through the years. You may get some of the mixing that I spoke about earlier, but in general, it's not plausible, really, And then a couple of Egyptian flood stories are mentioned. These are very, very brief. One, the god Tum says, "I'm going to deface all I have done. This earth will become an ocean through an inundation of water, as it was at the beginning." There's a couple of other bits and pieces that are not really that strong from Egypt, that some of the scholars do try and connect back to the story of Noah as well. And then in China, like I say, some of these stories are a bit bizarre and probably do point to local flooding, at least from some stages of the past. In one of them, it says the first emperor of China, Fo He, was produced supernaturally from a rainbow. He is said to have bred 7 sorts of animals for sacrifice, and that he appeared in the country after a convulsion in which waters in the bosom of the earth burst forth, so we have the rising up again, and then overflowed upon the earth. He was attended by his wife and 3 sons and 3 daughters, by whose intermarriage the whole circle of the earth was repopulated and inhabited again. So some say that may actually be an actual mixture of a native tradition and some missionary teaching. But there's other Chinese stories that are totally devoid of missionary influence.
Yeah, so the point is, like, we are not saying that necessarily every story has no missionary influence. There could be some minor here and there. Definitely that's the case. But then of also going with this bold claim that all of them have been influenced by missionaries, I mean, that's too far-fetched.
Yeah, totally too far. And like I said, to finish on Frazer, the book that includes the flood section is called Folklore in the Old Testament. And in a later article he wrote, he asks, are the resemblances due to transmission with modification from one people to another, either directly or through intermediary peoples, or have they arisen independently through the similar workings of the human mind in reaction to flood circumstances? So he says both. He says each particular case must be weighed on its own and refer to one or the other. Or he said it's also possible that you can combine between the opinions, as I said earlier, and then he suggests that many cultures may have had similar experiences of great floods. But it doesn't make sense to have a similar experience of this type of flood.
Yeah, exactly. Because in the end, why would everyone talk about all of humanity resetting in some sense?
Yeah. All of humanity being destroyed and all of humanity reset. So let's have a little look at some of the Middle Eastern stories.
Yeah.
Because these are the stories that the Bible has said, the biblical story is said to have been influenced by.
Okay. So one thing I would like to mention.
Before we go there, go ahead.
I was saying, like, for the audience to understand that, if there are like 200 to 500 stories, I mean, they, like, they should not expect that, we would be able to cover all of them over here in this conversation. The fact that we are doing some of them, I mean, should actually drive the point home at least.
Yeah.
To the conclusion that we want to derive, I think, with some examples, I think should be more than enough to for the audience to understand, how deep this subject is.
Yeah, let's do 4 or 5 of the tribal stories before going to the Middle East.
Okay.
So this one is from the natives of the Leeward Islands in the Northeast Caribbean. It says, soon after the peopling of the world, the sea god Ruhatu was reposing in his coralline groves in the depths of the ocean. These waters were sacred and fishing was taboo there. But a certain fisherman disregarded the prohibition and lowered his line till the hook became caught in the hair of the sleeping god. You see, I told you the stories become simple and silly. But still, it's a transgression against something they consider to be divine,
Right.
So he tried his best to pull his line back up, but he succeeded only in waking up Ruhatu. So Ruhatu appeared at the surface and scolded him for his impiety and declared that mankind was all equally impious and the whole land was to be destroyed. So the fisherman begged forgiveness, and then Ruhatu was moved by his plea. So he didn't decide not to destroy mankind. He just told him to take him, his wife, and his family to a small island called Tuamarama, where he would find refuge. So the man took his wife, his family, a friend, a dog, a pig, and 2 fowl. They no sooner reached the place of refuge than the waters began to rise, rising up again, driving all inhabitants from their dwellings, and gradually increasing in one day until only the tops of the mountains appeared, and soon after they were covered and everyone died. When the waters subsided, he left with his family and they took up their abode on the mainland, and they became the progenitors of the current population. So you have, I don't know, you can't really call that a moral cause, but it's a disobedience against someone they consider divine. You don't have a warning, but you have, I suppose, a granting of safe passage to a very small number of people. You have the taking on board of animals onto the ark. You have the rising to the mountaintops. And then you have the repopulation of the world from whoever that was.
Right.
So,
And this, yes, just one thing I would like to mention is that, when we look at these cultures, like, since we know when the whole concept of monotheism and of God gets distorted so badly, as like, we can see in many cultures. So it's very natural that, what, like, the kind of stories that we have in monotheistic cultures, there will be many polytheistic elements that also gets added to it. If they don't leave the they don't leave God, I mean, like, just like, it's very natural for all other things that we get from revelation would get distorted in some or the other way.
Yeah. And even when you fall into polytheism, the deeper you go into shirk, even though some of these tribes, they retain their belief in a supreme God, their conception of the supreme God becomes totally debased as well. Like I said in the monotheism video, for them, the incarnations and the ridiculous stories that sometimes are told about the supreme God of their culture, they don't reduce the Rububiyyah attributes, so to speak, of eternality, creation, being all powerful, etc. Obviously, they can't go together in reality, but for them, they don't reduce these attributes, even though they believe in incarnations and like silly things happening and so on and so forth. But you lose everything when you fall to shirk. Everything changes. That's like some people have asked what harm does shirk actually do, but it's a very naive question to ask, because what you believe about God or what you don't believe about God will affect everything you do.
Exactly.
You fully hold those beliefs. You understand? Like belief and action, they can't be separated. Right. That's what Quran and Islam is: belief, statement, and action. Because if you truly believe in Allah, there are certain things you won't do, or at least you'll try not to do it. You may fall into them here and there, like everyone, not sinless. And there are a lot of things that you will do, which you otherwise wouldn't do. It's because of what you believe. But when your concept of the Creator, if you don't believe in a God, or your concept of the Creator becomes debased, like the Mushrikun of Arabia, then your whole worldview changes. So your actions.
Exactly.
So shirk actually causes harm. It causes a lot of harm. When you have to deep it, though. You can't just look at someone praying to an idol and say what harm they are doing. You've got to think, Yeah. But moving on. We have the Pimas of northern Mexico. They relate that a certain sage or even prophet was warned by an eagle that a flood was coming. But the sage laughed at him. He then got a second and third warning, which were also unheeded. So not until there came a sudden blast of thunder and a great green mound of water raised itself over the plain did he believe the warning. But by then it was too late. So only one man, but not the prophet or sage, that's why he's calling the story, he saved himself by floating on a ball of resin. This man, whose name was Zuka, turned out to be a son of the Creator. Like I've just said, this is what happens when you fall into shirk. He subsequently sought out the eagle which had given warning and climbed up a cliff where the eagle lived, and he found there many, many corpses, mangled and rotting, which had already been carried off and devoured. He then raised them to life and sent them away to repeople the earth. We are told that warning was given repeatedly, but was unheeded by those who were forewarned. I cannot recall such a circumstance. This is what's the commentary on the story. I cannot recall such a circumstance in any of the other stories, except this one from the Pimas. And the second point of interest is that only one individual escaped, thereby making it a logical impossibility for him to re-people the earth the regular way. So now we have a reflection of some of the practical good sense of the natives in how they come up with the re-peopling of the earth if only one person lives, you know.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, that's quite a short story, but interesting. Have some unique aspects, you know.
And how many we maybe might cover for the Middle Eastern stories?
3.
Okay.
There's 3 main versions. They have some other versions, but you have Sumerian, Babylonian, Akkadian. So they're all from the same part of the world now, basically.
Okay.
The next one is from the Singpo of Burma. They say that when the flood came, there's nothing here about a warning or anything. A man named Pao Pao Nan Chong and his sister Chanko saved themselves in a large boat. They had with them 9 cocks, 9 birds, and 9 needles. After some time, they flung one of the birds overboard with the needle to see whether the water was falling. So they didn't hear the crow strike the bottom, the cock strike the bottom. They did the same thing day after day until the 9th day, when the last cockerel he crew and the needle was heard to hit a rock. So very soon the brother and sister left the boat and they wandered about until they came to a cave in which lived a male and a female elf. Soon afterward, the sister gave birth to a child, but the elf was a witch, got very angry whenever the baby cried. So when the brother and sister were out, in a fury, the witch ran off with the baby and hacked it into pieces. Yes, the poor mom came home and heard what had been done, so she cried to the Great Spirit to give her child back and avenge its death. The Great Spirit said, I cannot put your baby back together again, but instead I will make you the mother of all the nations of men to come. And so, from one section of the country where the body parts had been strewn, the bits and pieces came up to life and sprang up the Shans. From another, the Chinese, from another, the Burmese,
Oh.
from another, the forefathers of the Bengalis, and eventually all the race of mankind. And the bereaved mother claimed all of them as her children because they all sprang from the scattered remains of her murdered child. So here you have a little bit of the spreading out of mankind as well in the story.
Right.
You know, you got the fantastic elements as well. You don't have the warning. You do have the minimal amount of people saved. And you do have the repeopling of the earth from them. Again, in a little bit of a odd way, but still. A couple of stories from Australia. This is from the Bundaba tribe. Long ago, there was a great flood. It originated because some children who found a winking earl in a tree pulled out all of its feathers. They stuck a grass reed through its nose as well and treated the bird most shamefully. So the bird managed to fly without wings into the heavens and showed himself to Ngawungu, the great father, according to them. Ngawungu became very angry and decided to drown all of mankind. Later, people saw a small cloud rise, which became bigger and bigger until it covered the whole sky. The thunder began to roll and crash, and people were greatly afraid. With the rain and thunder was a terrible wind which broke the limbs off trees and rooted up others. There was an awful noise from the thunder. The noise was coming from the north. The salt water and the sea came pouring over the ranges from the north. The flood rose higher and higher till all the land was covered except the tops of 2 or 3 of the highest mountains. From further west, a man and his wives with a dog were battling their way in a canoe when a bird with a leaf in its mouth flew in front of them, showing them the way to Mount Bloom. They eventually reached and landed there. So the survivors of this one landed on Mount Bloom. Then Jabal Gari, the great left-handed man, cut his little finger and let the blood into the waters, and this made the waters recede. and disappeared, and all the other people were drowned besides those who got to land blue. So you've got a moral, well, yeah, I suppose you call that one a moral cause, more like an act of disobedience than the spread of much wickedness. You got a minimum amount of people saved. You've got the rising high. You've got the docking locally, and you've got the repeopling after from a small group of people. And the final tribal story is from the Wanambal tribe. Again, the owl is in this. So it came about.
Where is this tribe located?
They're Australian Aboriginal as well.
Okay.
So it came about at the earliest time children tormented and ill-treated the winking owl Dumbi. So Engadja, the supreme one, was grieved and felt deep sorrow for him. He instructed a man called Gadjara, if you want to live, take your wife, your sons, and your sons' wives and get a double raft. Because of the winking owl affair, I will drown everyone. I am about to send rain and a sea flood. Put on the long raft, long-lasting foods that may be stored. Foods such as gumi, banimba, and galindaja. All these ground foods. So Gadjara stored all these foods. He gathered the birds of the air such as the cuckoo, the mistletoe eater, the rainbow bird, the firebird, the finches. Those he took on the raft, and also a female kangaroo. He gathered his sons as the crew, and his wife and his sons' wives. Then Engadja sent the rain clouds down, shutting the clouds in upon them. The flood came in from the northeast. The people were closed in by the saltwater flood and the tidal waters of the sea. Engadja whirled the flood waters and the earth open, drowning and flattening them all. He finished at Dumbay. Meanwhile, the flood carried all those who were on the raft with the current far away to Dulagun. At last, the flood waters brought Gadjara back in this direction. He sent some birds out from the raft. First, the cuckoo. The cuckoo found land and did not return. Gradually, the waters began to recede. Later on, the other birds returned, and he sent them out again the following day. The land was already drying, and the living creatures found a home and food. They killed a kangaroo after landing, and Gadjara's wife put it in the earth oven and cooked it with other foods. The smoke rose until it reached through the sky, and Gadjara, the supreme being, smelled the steam rising and smoke rising from the female kangaroo as it was cooking. He was pleased. He then put the rainbow in the sky to keep the rain clouds back. The rainbow protects us so that the rainfall does not rise too high. Our people understand the significance of it. When we see the rainbow, we say there will not be any abnormally heavy rain. So the rainbow is actually another recurring detail, not in too many of them, but it does recur. It's in the biblical story as well.
Okay.
Yeah. So that's the last of the tribal stories, but I just want to reiterate, they're not all like this. Some of them, as I said, they become, even though these are quite simple, they become even more simple and really short. So I don't want to give a wrong impression that they're all like this. Plenty of them are. Don't get me wrong.
Okay.
Yeah, plenty of them are, but
And when we go back to this one particularly, also you find now in this one also regarding the animal part was also something that is a commonality.
yes,
Yeah.
different animals and slightly different uses, but they're like they regularly give a warning somehow, or they're used to test the level of the waters somehow.
Okay. Wow.
Yes. So I don't really see much point in going over more tribal stories, whether they're a bit more detailed or whether they're short and simple. I hope people are getting it.
Yeah. So like if you allow me, like, I have one very funny story
Yes.
which I have come across. Yeah, So I was going through so now there is this one fact we've understood that okay, there is so many stories, and at least some people would take that seriously, that there are, if so many cultures talk about a story, many people just completely disregard them, dismiss them. But then at least from the ancient alien community, they have apparently taken this story very seriously. They have also taken like these kind of Adam and Eve stories, which are also prevalent false stories, also which are very prevalent in many cultures. They have taken them also very seriously, which was a good thing. So I was going through some of their episodes where they were actually trying to make sense of, of how do you make sense of so many cultures talking about, first of all, a fall and then also a flood. Because both of these things we find common in many cultures. So first of all, they did acknowledge that, okay, they said something like the biblical account of Adam and Eve and Noah, and this was one of the episodes on ancient aliens. Noah's Ark really be retelling the extraterrestrial events. Of course, they are looking at all of this, but yeah, completely negating God, revelation, everything. And for them, this is more like extraterrestrials have some involvement with this. So they are like ancient astronaut theorist believes that perhaps future evidence can be found in the archaeological remnants and eyewitness accounts from man's earliest known civilizations. So there's ancient chronicles of sky beings creating human life are common in early cultures found all over the world. So what they are saying is, in some sense, that when we know that, okay, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created Adam alayhi salam directly, and many cultures hint to something, humanity being created directly from clay or something along those lines. They are saying that actually it's extraterrestrial having some involvement where they took the DNA of a monkey or they took something and they did some change to it, and that is how humanity started. So I find that quite funny. But anyways, then they have made so many claims about this. Many people regarding the UFO community actually believe in this. And but then what's more fascinating is that, author of Chariots of God, he was there on that episode, I think, and he mentioned specifically, I'm quoting him, he said, in my opinion, the extraterrestrials, by an artificial mutilation, created the intelligence of human beings, which means that they created Adam and Eve somehow from monkeys or doing some kind of genetic mutation or something along those lines. Then the extraterrestrial disappeared. So this is their narrative. And some of our ancestors had again sex with their ancestors. So they made a distinction between ape-like creatures and human beings by doing some kind of genetic mutation. And then according to them, they're trying to make sense of all of these cultures, talk about these stories. So they say, okay, so what might have happened is this kind of these beings, that human beings, this new project that they have created, had sex with the prior ancestors, like ape-like creatures. And some of the ancestors had sex with their ancestors, ape-like beings, and that was called into mythological original sin. So they say that is the original sin of mankind. And then the extraterrestrials returned again, the gods, he says. They realized what happened, and then they decided to destroy the whole race by a rain flood and to restart the experiment again with what we call mythological Noah. I was like, okay, yeah. So that makes a lot of sense. That, they went, first of all, they created human beings, and they did not, and the man fell into sin by having interbreeding with ape-like creatures, and then these kind of aliens realized, oh, the humanity did something, it's something like a sin, so let's punish them, and that is how the flood came in. So I found that was really funny to see all of these cultures, what they point to, completely not acknowledge God or revelation, and then try to construct your imaginary scenario, whatever you somehow just trying to link it with aliens. I mean, that makes no sense. But anyway, yeah. So that is something really ironic for me.
Yeah, it's quite bizarre, man. It's kind of like what we said in the beginning, how you can understand how some of the tribal cultures might have something to gain by making up a creation story, but nothing to gain from the flood story. It's kind of like a similar attempt, It's like they don't want to throw everything out as being absolute myth and fabrication, but they don't really want to live a life whereby, I suppose, they submit to God either. So,
right,
up with a story that leaves them free and easy,
right.
Yeah.
And what I believe is that, whatever mystery they find, like whatever mystery, they have to link it back somehow to extraterrestrial aliens or something.
Yeah.
So they're so desperate with that. So like, no matter what mystery you find, just link them to extraterrestrials. I mean, so that is kind of nonsensical. Anyway, yeah, you can continue with the Middle Eastern stories. Yeah, please go ahead.
Okay. There are three main versions of each Middle Eastern story. There is a Sumerian, there is a Babylonian, there is an Akkadian. So obviously the Sumeria was the precursor of both of those civilizations. So by default, the Sumerian story has to be older, but it was discovered later than the Babylonian and the Akkadian. And the Babylonian and the Akkadian do show some signs of borrowing between them, which is natural anyway, because it's the same area of the world.
Right.
So on, but the dates of the artifacts found are not the dates the scholars give for the origin of the stories. Even though the artifacts are ancient, they say the stories are more ancient. So I'll just start with the Akkadian one. The latest artifact with the Akkadian story is from the 7th century BC, but there's an older version from 1650 BC. They know it's older from the dating methods, but also the language used is a lot more, I believe someone described it as like the equivalent of Babylonian Shakespeare compared to the later one. So the language used is older and much more sophisticated. The estimated date of composition is 1800 BC. So it's even taken to be 150 years older than the artifact. Don't have time to go into this story. It's a long, long story. It's called Atrahasis epic. That's the main character, Atrahasis. In this, the gods are just annoyed by humanity and the spread of humans, the multiplication of the human race, and the noise they make. So some of them decide to wipe out humanity. The god Ea, he warns the wise man Atrahasis, giving him instructions on how to build a boat. Like some lines of the thing are missing in all of them, as far as I know. Many in the Sumerian, actually. So he survives the flood and offers a sacrifice afterwards. The gods regret their decision. And Ea proposes measures like mortality, infertility, and stuff like this to control human population from there on. So again, it's not a moral cause. It's more an infringement on the Akkadian gods, I suppose, for want of a better word. But humanity is wiped. One god warns one person. I believe his wife survives as well. Yeah, humanity wiped. Infringement. One person warned, one person saved. However, he's not called the father of mankind after this, but it would be implied that he must have repopulated the earth anyway, if him and whoever was on the boat, instructions to build a boat in this one as well, were saved. So the language is Akkadian, and it uses the cuneiform script. Now I go to the Babylonian flood story, which is actually a section of a longer story. The Epic of Gilgamesh is very well known anyway. I hope that needs them. But in one part of the epic, you have the flood story. Again, the artifacts, the earliest artifact we have is 7th century BC, which is a Neo-Assyrian copy. It's estimated to be either from 1000 BC or 1300 BC. Generally, some estimates are much older. And also some of the characters mentioned are found in much older legends as well. That's one of the reasons why scholars have estimated to be older as well.
Okay.
So one of Gilgamesh's friends dies. So he becomes distraught, and he eventually realizes he doesn't want to die himself. So he's told to go looking for Utnapishtim, who was the main character of the flood story, because Utnapishtim knows how to get immortality. So just like Atrahasis, Utnapishtim is warned by Ea to build a boat in this story. again, the story is way longer than this. Anyone can go and look it up, part of the Epic of Gilgamesh. After the flood, his boat rests on a mountain, and he releases birds to find land. The gods, because he's the chosen one, they grant immortality to him and his wife, and from there on in, they will reside in a semi-divine realm or a divine realm. So you have a Neo-Assyrian version, standard Babylonian version. It's written in cuneiform script again, but just keep in mind, he gained immortality with his wife. Now, those were discovered before the Sumerian version. So the Sumerian version is the earliest known version. There's many sections of the story, big sections of the story are missing, where you can kind of fill in some of the blanks. It's connected to the creation story. So the scholars have said this is such a seismic event. The flood story is such a seismic event for them. It's like it's cosmic enough to be added to their creation story. Just like the Santali tribe I mentioned in the monotheism video, they connect their creation story to a destruction because of mankind's wickedness via fire, water, or rainwater. Subsequently, population and migration story. In Sumeria, the story is connected. And in this, a number of gods are involved somehow, some way. But basically, long story short, the god Enlil decides to destroy humanity with a flood. The god Enki secretly warns Ziusudra, a pious king, instructing him to build a large boat. And Ziusudra survives this flood, and he's also granted immortality, okay? So you have two stories, immortality. Keep that in mind as well. The artifact is dated to 1600 BC, but it's estimated to be from 2000 to 2100 BC. But some scholars say no, it has to be from 2900 BC, because by 2000 BC, Sumeria was fading out and it was getting overrun by Babylon anyway. And the characters, again, are mentioned in other works, other documents which are older. There's also an art, like this story is called Eridogenesis. It's on a clay tablet, written on a clay tablet. There's also another artifact called the Sumerian King List. Now, the main character is mentioned in the King List as well, Ziusudra. And what's interesting about the King List, guess what the main demarker in the middle of the King List is? Yes.
No clue. Tell me.
The flood.
Oh.
The King List has pre-flood King List. And after the flood that swept over the land, it has the ones.
So, wow.
Ziusudra is mentioned, but there's 8 to 10 pre-flood kings, and they're sometimes given unrealistically long life periods, like tens of thousands of years. It says the flood then swept over the land. We know what flood it's talking about from the early Genesis story. And it then says kingship was lowered again from heaven, because I spoke about how the Sumerians believed kingship was given from heaven in the monotheism video. And new dynasties began, starting with the first dynasty of Kish, which was considered the first post-flood kingship, which was actually a real city as well. So the flood marks a cosmic reset for the Sumerians. It's mentioned in a number of things, and like I said, some of the characters in each of the stories are mentioned in non-flood related documents as well, which is one of the reasons the scholars estimate the old ages. Because Gilgamesh was already known by 2100 BC in the Babylonian story, and he's famous all over the Middle East. His name is to be found in stories all over the Middle East. So maybe he could have been an ancient culture, that got elevated into, like, I don't know what you call them, like, I don't know if they worshipped him or not, but he may have been a real culture, considering he's to be found everywhere, and just got blown out of all proportion, They even say the Atrahasis epic is older than the Gilgamesh story. Yeah.
Okay.
And Ziusudra appears in some versions of the Atrahasis epic, So he's from the oldest version again, this character, Sumerian story. So Gilgamesh was central in Mesopotamian myth by the Ur-3 period, which is 2100 to 2000 BC. Yeah, those are the main details. So similarities between the stories: divine punishment through a catastrophic flood, a righteous man warned by a god, hero builds a vessel upon instructions to preserve life, gods come to regret their decision. Afterwards, the survivor offers a sacrifice, and birds are sent out to check if the land is dry in Gilgamesh and Atrahasis epics. And the reason I highlighted the immortality part of the Babylonian and the Sumerian flood story is because this is nowhere to be found in the biblical story. You get it? Because these are stories the biblical story was said to be derived from. So that's one central theme that has disappeared. The polytheism has disappeared. According to the principles of those who study folklore, it should increase. And even though the stories in the Middle East are closer to the biblical story, like there's some detailed instructions of how many stories to build on the ark and to caulk it up with bitumen to make it waterproof and stuff, it still has a lot more fantastic elements. Plus, the discovery of the Sumerian story kind of pulled out the foundations of those who say they're derived from the Babylonian stories, because the most conservative estimate of the age of the story in Genesis is 600 BC, up to 1000 BC and a little more, depending on whether you use the actual chronology in the Bible or not. Yeah, but many say it's around 3000 years old. So all of these are older than it by default, far older, especially the Sumerian king list. And they have the fantastical elements that the biblical story doesn't have. So the most logical explanation is the biblical story is a large remnant of revelation, whereas these ones are clearly not. But they seem to point to something that did occur and was very well held to in many ways, or many of the details were held to by the Mesopotamian cultures, you know. So let's have a little look how they do Genesis. So there's a creation story, number of different gods involved, lines missing.
This is regarding which one?
Sumeria.
Okay.
Yeah, lines missing, says man was created to work. Then kingship was sent down from heaven. The royal throne was sent down. The king was regularly performed to perfect rituals and services and build in particular spots. And different cities are allotted here to different kings. Lines missing, number of lines missing. Lines missing, there's a council of the gods. An, Enlil, Enki, and Ninhursag had the gods of heaven and earth swear by the names of An and Enlil. At that time, Ziusudra was king and Lustration priest. He fashioned being a seer, the god of giddiness, and stood in awe beside it. Like, you can clearly see there's translation problems with some of these stories, because in English, a number of the sentences don't make sense. As he stood there regularly day after day, he heard something that was not a dream, a swearing of oaths by heaven and earth, touching of throats, and the gods bringing their thwarts up to Kiur. As he stood there, he went on hearing, step up to the wall to my left and listen. This is when they give him a warning that the floods are going to sweep over the cities and country, and mankind is to be destroyed. A verdict has been made, a command which cannot be revoked. The order of An and Enlil is not known to ever have been countermanded. Listen to what I say to you. Then winds, stormy winds gather, the flood sweeps over the cities for 7 days and 7 nights. The evil wind tosses the big boat about on the green waters. Then the sun comes out and spreads light over heaven and earth. Ziusudra drills a hole in the boat. Seems to have the waters have receded, but it doesn't say that. Then he offers sacrifices, and he is told, you here have sworn by life's breath of heaven and life's breath of earth, that he verily is allied with yourself. You there, An and Enlil, have sworn by the life's breath of heaven and earth that he is allied with all of you. He will disembark the small animals that come up from the earth. So Ziusudra, being king, stepped up before An and Enlil, kissing the ground. And An and Enlil did well by him, granting him life like a god's, or making lasting breath of life like a god's descent into him. That day they made Ziusudra preserver as king of the name of the small animals and the seed of all mankind, lived toward the east over the mountains in Mount Tilma. So it doesn't say, like lots of the story is missing, it doesn't say what mankind did. However, the gods decided to wipe out mankind. They've warned one man who they thought was worthy. He's built a ship, flood has come, wiped everyone out. He sent out some animals, or animals are involved in the story in some way. The water has receded. He gets made immortality, but also he's the father of mankind now as well.
Right.
So we've got all the base similarities there pretty much, except for the reason for the flood. Those are the stories that people count as.
Wow. I mean, we just covered a few, and there's so much of similarity between them. So that's really fascinating. Is there any other section that we are going to cover now?
Just a little more. I think we can finish quite soon, inshallah.
Inshallah.
Yeah, so basically the biblical account was accused of being based on the Babylonian and similar myths instead of being on an actual event. But afterwards, the Sumerian account was discovered, which is far older than even the Babylonian and the Akkadian accounts. So that's an evidence leading towards the flood actually being a real event, not simply a concoction of the Babylonian or Akkadian imaginations, or even their version of some localized flood, because we now have an even older version. And in Sumeria, connected to the creation story, and unlike the other two, Ziusudra is said to be the seed of mankind after. In comparison to the Sumerian Babylonian stories, the biblical account has unique aspects. It is the most detailed account available and is fiercely monotheistic, while the other accounts are strongly polytheistic.
Yeah, and any person who does not understand how, what degenerates from what, maybe they can actually watch our first discussion, which is a very, very interesting discussion on this topic.
Very useful. Because I remember that we had the Santali story there. That's actually kind of related to these stories as well.
And what we spoke about actually gives a paradigm, a lens to which we can actually look at the past myths as well, because when we know what, how polytheism degenerates from monotheism, and monotheism is most of the time in cultures we see, the more we go back, the more the culture points or hints towards monotheism. When we use that as a lens to actually understand cultures, it gives us more clarity on many of these things. So that is, I think, a very important part within this investigation as well. If anyone has not gone through the discussion, I think it's more fundamental than this. They should actually go through that discussion, and that would give them more insight into looking at this discussion, I believe.
Yes.
More gems can be drawn within this discussion.
If actually goes through that, yeah, have a look. Definitely have a look at that one. And if you haven't seen the language episode, that's the 2 episodes is well worth a watch as well. And the story the stories that we spoke about earlier in part 2. Which section are they in? The differing in languages. They're part of that section.
Yeah.
So I had planned to actually bring more like counters to the idea that the flood was a real event. And I actually found quite a few of them, but they kind of all rest on the main points, the main counters being correct anyway. And they're side points. So I don't think it's really worth bringing them that much, but I just want to have a look at one article here. It's called Dismantling Answers in Genesis Worldwide Flood Claims. It's on Patios, which is a known atheist website, secular website. And by someone called Libby Ann. Let me just check. I had a reference for who she was. I think I lost it. Yeah, apparently she's taken some classes in her undergraduate, including classes on ancient myth and whatnot. And she references a story from Hawaii, a story from the American plains, a story from Peru, a story from Hudson Bay, a story from Scandinavia, or at least part of the story, because that's a longer story. A story from Tanzania. Now I'm going to stop there before I get to the rest of it. She adds Western Australia and China, and she kind of sets up another kind of a straw man here as well, or a reverse straw man. So these are all very brief stories. Very, very brief stories. I'll just read one or two of them. Peru, the creator of Viracocha, sent a flood to destroy the unruly giants he had made. Only 2 giants survived in a boat, which landed at Tiahuanaco. The creator then made animals to fill the earth, and he made people from clay. In the Hudson Bay story, one of the gods became angry at the giants and decided to drown them in a flood. But he warned a man to build a large canoe. The man sent out an otter who retrieved dirt from which the man remade the earth. Now, she tries to impose missionary influence on these stories. One of them has a man descend on a rainbow, and the character is called Nuh. So maybe the name is related to Noah. That could be from missionary influence. It could be. But it has the creator descend on a rainbow to reveal he was the one who saved mankind. Who offered pig and coconuts to thank the moon, because him and his family were saved on a large boat. Now, the crux of our argument, all of these, is that none of these tribes had written languages before the arrival of the missionaries in the 1800s and the 1900s. So we have no way to compare what this story was before the missionary influence. She accuses others of leaving out missionary influence and saying they simply present the legend in its final form as though it were developed independently. She said the same thing for the American Plains flood legend. She starts combining, saying this flood was a regional flood. So like it was said in the list of the scholars first, she's not offering any evidence that the stories were tampered with. Plus, most of them don't have any biblical reflection. No, she's just giving a possibility. You get it?
Right.
She's saying because
and then she's taking it.
Sorry?
Yeah, I believe she's taking it as a default. I'm saying I believe she's taking it as a default that now that if you have any involvement of missionaries, then therefore anything that comes out has to be tampered with by them or something.
Yeah, because she's saying the stories were written down. But pre-missionary, the tribes didn't have writing, which is correct. So how can we trust that they're tampered? She's just giving a possibility. She's not giving evidence of that, you know?
Yeah, but then an equal possibility is that they were not tampered. There is no evidence given.
Equal possibility.
By that.
Possibility.
Yes, exactly.
But so far, she has ignored all the similarities of the foundational points. You get it? And she's coming in saying these floods were regional floods.
Right, okay. Yeah, and then we already refuted that.
I'm not suggesting that they didn't have their own flood stories before they calling them missionaries, because she knows she can't do this.
Oh,
They probably did. After all
okay.
floods occurred in both locations, it makes sense that oral cultures would include stories about. But again, going back to the nature of the floods,
Yeah,
they're not described as tidal waves or earthquakes, and
exactly.
we have the same kind of scenario in the biblical narrative of the waters rising up to the levels in the mountains. This is not what happens in a local flood. You know, she just can't do
Exactly.
it well. And she accuses the missionary of syncretism.
Oh,
And she accuses some missionaries of pulling out the closest similarities in those stories, which they may have done, to prove their point that these mimic the biblical story, but while leaving out other aspects of stories that do not align as well with the story. But not all of them did that, because I've told you there's Christian scholars that clearly admitted that some of them have biblical influence quite strongly.
hmm.
Some of them may have. Some of them may have local events or actual local events infused into the story as well. Yeah. So again, she maintains missionary tampering, but again, she's taken a very, very reductive viewpoint on the whole thing. She clearly hasn't studied it very much, because there are massive collections from Christians and non-Christians of flood stories, and analysed by both as well. She doesn't go to the analyses. Again, same thing, Peruvian story, syncretism, missionary activity. And she says there are multiple different versions of this story. Again, that's accounted for by some of the people who analysed. She mentions the Scandinavian story, which seems to be cut. She's cut a piece of it out, focused on a small piece. Listen to this. This is all she puts from the story. Scandinavia. When Odin killed the first frost giant, Ymir, his blood deluged the earth, meaning flooded it. The frost giant Bergelmir and his wife survived in a hollowed out tree. Interestingly, even Norse mythology is not free from syncretism. Christian missionaries spent hundreds of years working to convert those of Northern Europe, and these stories were not written down until hundreds of years after the Norse converted to Christianity. When they were written down, they were written down by Christian monks and scholars. If you actually open the Scandinavian stories, you'll see like they're about as pagan as you can get.
Oh,
Like even the considered flood stories, like floods are just a bigger part of major destruction stories like Ragnarok and all these things. But she boldly claims Norse mythology is not free from syncretism, and I haven't looked into it enough to disqualify that. But certainly, the stories that you can go online and read and research for yourself, there's no way you get that impression. Again, she just gives the logical possibility. They were written down hundreds of years after the Norse converted by Christian monks and scholars. But going back to what we said earlier, why on earth, like, to add in bits and pieces of a flood story is no gain. It's no gain for them.
exactly.
They gain nothing.
Exactly.
You know, you could have added in some prophecy leading up to the biblical Jesus. Surely we would have done that instead.
Exactly. And there's no value to just adding one event within
Yeah.
the whole bigger literature. Just one event, one historical event, maybe of some flood happening, has no value. They could have done something valuable.
And now she mentions the collection of the flood stories around the Middle East. These myths were likely the result of constant flooding of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. The thing to bear in mind is that stories passed among these cultures. In other words, these flood myths were not in fact developed independently. As I've said, the Babylonian and Akkadian ones, they do share similarities, but again, they don't have any trait of local flooding. You know, going back to the Sumerian stories, Ea-Sumer is literally given the title the seed of all mankind. He's made immortal by the gods, he's blessed, and he's given the title of the seed of mankind. So she says the Gilgamesh story, the Epic of Gilgamesh and Noah's flood were passed down through generations directly from the actual event, according to Christian claims. The two stories they claim are independent evidences that such a flood occurred. The problem is that these stories cannot be claimed to be truly independent of each other. Indeed, it appears likely that the Epic of Gilgamesh, which was well known in the biblical world, influenced the story of Noah's flood. Zero reasons given. It doesn't address the reasons that rebut this. Then she mentions the Western Australian story. Again, zero reasons given. She just says, see also missionaries. She mentions a number of the Chinese myths. Again, says they don't appear to have been written down until after missionary influence. She says then again, another totally unsubstantiated claim. She says that the Miao people, who are indeed like a tribal people in China, they took the myths from the Chinese civilization myths. Yet it was the missionaries who created the Miao people's alphabet. Again, it's just assumption after assumption and ending only with a possible scenario. No actual concrete evidence, no facts.
Right.
And here we get to the crux of it. Growing up, it was never mentioned to me that many of the flood myths I was told about from around the world were only written down after these cultures were influenced by missionary activity. This matters a lot. It means stories were not truly independent. So going back to the scenario we mentioned, I'd like everyone to think back to the scenario we mentioned of pre-modern communication era, missionaries going from different European countries who didn't know each other, couldn't possibly have had contact with each other, and somehow the continent of the world not making up some prophecies that bolster Christian theology, not talking about all the other Old Testament stories, just some small flood story which is unrelated to Christian theology. As we said, you can completely...
Yeah, that's a very nice point.
And she's on this flex, you know. It's interesting it's growing up. I wouldn't be surprised if you spoke to this person face to face. She probably has issues with being raised as a Christian. Because otherwise, why would you mention growing up, you know? Sometimes you got to read between the lines.
Yeah, and you know, this was a very good example. Like all of the missionaries who have no contact with each other and have gone scattered all over the world. They don't have like a WhatsApp group or something where they are planning and conspiring that, oh, let's put the story of Noah, like, you know, in all of their cultures like that. So why would every missionary think of something which has no value to their mission, and then they try to infiltrate that? Forget about how hard it is, or sometimes it is like next to impossible to do something like it, even if you want to do it. I mean, why would you do it in the first place? It makes no sense at all.
Exactly. Plus, she makes two more points. In point 3, she mentions the creationist list of flood stories being so striking and their similarities. However, she doesn't mention any of the similarities themselves. This is why I mentioned that point before the second point. Because she said that many cultures have flood myths does not mean there was a global flood. Indeed, many cultures' flood stories only allege a regional flood. However, again, going back to the details we mentioned of the type of flooding and the fact that the earth was repopulated after, it's clear they're not speaking about a regional flood. It's possible. Water coming up to the height of the mountains as well. Water rises to its own level. You know, these people were not stupid. You know what I mean? Water rises to its own level, or else it bottoms out. You know, so the flood for them was obviously a worldwide event. And like some of the scholars I mentioned in the first section, people created myth to understand the world. Flood was one thing they needed to understand. I really doubt it. You know, you think people with their day-to-day struggles and hardships and joys, and family business and actually needed to understand floods? No, sorry. The striking nature of the similarities is dependent on seeing these stories as developing independently from one another, and they did not. In addition to missionary activity, there is the reality that the Epic of Gilgamesh had already circulated widely translated before the composition of Genesis, and it's said that they are to be rooted in the same event or oral tradition. Yes, but those two things, event or oral tradition, are not identical. The author alleges that they are retellings of the same flood of Noah. What he doesn't seem to understand that it is far more likely the two stories are rooted in the same oral tradition, not an event. She doesn't say which one, doesn't give any reason why it's far more likely. Yeah. So she took some classes in classics in her undergrad, including classes on ancient myth. Scholars of myth frequently look at the way stories change over time and the ways one story influences another. Again, no details given. It is possible there was a specific large regional flood that spawned the Epic of Gilgamesh and the story of Noah's flood. It is more likely that the Epic of Gilgamesh was written down far earlier and had a far wider spread, influenced the story of Noah's flood. But again, I don't know if she knows about the Sumerian version. If she does, she has conveniently ignored it. If she doesn't, she should do, if she's going to be talking about the Epic of Gilgamesh at least. Because again, that's a flood sent from the heavens. God's clearly said they're going to wipe mankind. Reason missing. But then, waves reach a particular height. One man re-peoples the earth. He becomes the seed of mankind, pre-Epic of Gilgamesh. And she ignores then that the fantastic elements from all those stories are not in the biblical story either. So yeah. Like I said, I was going to do the same for some other refutations, but they all rely on certain things being proven, which they don't manage to prove. You see.
Yeah, exactly. So I think taking on one example and then putting the point across that many of these people who try to refute this being some or the other way an historical event, they are building on some or the other things which we have already refuted in the discussion, where
Yes.
missionary influence or something along those lines, or all of the stories independently actually having some kind of experiencing some local flood and not having any connection uh to all of humanity. These things are something that we have already refuted. So if they are basing their whole claims on these foundations which are dubious in some sense, then their whole case gets refuted. So there's no point actually going through each one, because we'll just reiterate the same points again and again and again.
Yeah. The main points are not going to change anything.
Right. Yeah.
I think it's a fair conclusion, a very fair conclusion. Obviously, we accept the flood narrative anyway. It's part of Revelation. So we accept it anyway. But even if you don't, if you're someone that doesn't, the alternative explanation for the prevalence of the flood stories found across the globe don't really make much sense. A huge list of stories, an absolute tremendous list of stories. Well, this thing just goes on and on. So I found one list containing 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 11 stories from Europe, 2, 5, 9 from the Middle East, what looks like about 15 from Africa. And like I said, the stories in Africa tend to be much more brief. And if you saw them by themselves, you wouldn't really think much, except 1 or 2 of them, which definitely have missionary influence, undoubted. Many from Asia. He's got about 35 from Siberia down to different parts of China, India, Bengal, Malay, Philippines, Borneo, oh no, what looks like about 12 or 13 from Australia, similar number from the Pacific Islands, loads upon loads from North America, and I don't count. Central America looks like about 20.
Wow.
4, 6, 10, 15, 20. Looks like about 35 from South America. Yeah. I might just send you the list so you can put it up on the screen. Obviously, you don't have
Yeah.
the whole story. Yeah.
Yeah. Wow. I mean, but that's fascinating. So much. I mean, so much to look at. And one thing I actually enjoyed in this discussion is just investigating something solely by just shared memory within human cultures. This is not something many people do, and I think this was very unique about this conversation in compared to many conversations that we've had. Like, this was specific, a very peculiar way of trying to see uh, a historicity of something by just human shared memory. And I think uh, I would love to have more conversations just doing this, because this is a unique thing that not many people, even within many scholars, actually do. So yeah, I think this is a very unique opportunity to actually contribute so much to like for to humanity altogether, where of course there are some that are already there, but trying to do an overall analysis on all of them and trying to get the most rational conclusion out of it. I think that's a very uh I think that's a very unique job, I believe.
Yeah.
Alhamdulillah.
Yeah, maybe in the future we can do something similar with some other
Inshallah.
some other categories of shared story,
Inshallah. Is there anything more to cover?
No, that's about it. Hold it back.
Alhamdulillah. It was a fascinating conversation. A lot to cover. But
Yes.
Alhamdulillah, once it's done, it like you get Alhamdulillah, a new avenue altogether opens up, at least in my mind, where now I have deeper insight into the flood stories and how to navigate between them. Alhamdulillah. I hope the audience also enjoy this conversation. Any closing remarks that you have?
No, I'm done, man. You?
Alhamdulillah. Alhamdulillah. Yeah. So my closing remark, obviously, I would reiterate what I said, is about there being so many gems within human shared memory and within cultures. Since the first conversation that we had, we see cross cultural similarity between which show within their genealogy of their cultures. They go back to monotheism, belief in one god. You then mention also not just belief in one god, but traits about or qualities of that being of god is common to some extent. And then you mentioned how I think some offerings that they do is mentioned. The prayer that they have is also very similar at times within primitive tribes. And then also the stories which are very common, like false stories are very common. Maybe we can address that later on some other day, regarding the whole origin story of humanity altogether, which has so much of similarity. Like some examples are like being from clay, being created from some kind of clay, so they're descending from above, something along those lines. And then
Also,
other things as well.
life is considered to be breath.
Yeah. Yeah, that is also an important thing which you find cross culturally.
Yeah.
And then a very important aspect, a very important part of human history within cultures is also this flood. So yeah, there are so many gems, and now within the contemporary narrative, all of this is completely neglected. So I think doing this kind of research, this kind of task, I think aligns us back with our 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 true nature, our true history of where we come from. And it gives us so many different gems about our history, about religion altogether. And that I find this very fascinating. Though it's a very tedious task, I believe it's not easy. And I commend you for actually, like, I know it might take a lot of time to go through so many cultures. It's not an easy job. So may Allah reward you for this task, and may Allah reward you immensely. Ameen. And may Allah accept our effort. And I hope audience enjoy this. And if anyone in the audience enjoy such conversations and enjoy this new avenue that we are kind of pursuing now, maybe we can do other aspects of humanity, of shared memory, which kind of links back to something about us, that tells us something about us. Inshallah, we can do in the near future. Inshallah ta'ala. Jazakallah khairan for coming, and I would look forward to have more opportunities speaking to you.
Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.